this room. I think most of you are the same generation as me. I fair to say that. So I'm going to address these remarks to your younger selves, with the hope that you'll convey some of these sentiments to the students that you teach or the younger people that you influence in your lives. The title of this talk is Einfuhlen. Take a moment to look around this room. Note the people sitting next to you. How are they wearing their hair?
Thanks.
What kind of jewelry and sartorial fashion do you see? How are they shod? How do they speak? In regional accents, in jargon, in slang? Do your friends smoke? Do they walk about with the buds of iPhones or iPods plugged into their ears? Are they constantly texting? Are they more focused on people in cyberspace than on the people right in front of them? These kinds of questions could go on and on. They are the visual and audible details of our life at this moment in time, in this place today. And someday, this moment will be so far away, so obscure, so unknown, so mysterious, that some future generation of historians or archaeologists will need all their skills and ingenuity to figure us out. Who were those people? Will they know us by how we dressed, by what tools and gadgets we used, by the books we read, or the music we listened to? Will they know us by the language we spoke or the words we wrote? Will they know us by what we believed, or by how we thought, or by what was in our hearts? And how could they even know such things about us? Would we seem strange to that future generation? Would they be able to see and to hold in one vision our difference and our sameness? Could they discern through technological inquiry unknowable to us psychological and cultural similarities across the centuries and millennia? Could they peer past the once lost, then rediscovered relics of our lives to discover who we really were, without imposing themselves on us, without burdening us with so many layers of their own prejudices and assumptions, so that all they would be seeing of us is flawed, undeveloped, obscure shadow images of their own selves. Gore Vidal once wrote, quote, "Our writers and directors tend to know as little about the country's history as the audience. So when they set a story in the past, the characters are just like us, except they're in costume. But the past is another country. And to bring it to some sort of dramatic life takes a capacity for which there is no English word. It was not until the 18th century that a German, J.G. Herder, coined Einfuhlen, the act of feeling one's way into the past, not by holding up a mirror, but by stepping through the mirror into the alien world." Close quote. In Herder's book, Outlines of a Philosophy of the History of Man, written in Weimar in 1784 and published in English in 1799, he speaks of, quote, "perceiving a distant mind," close quote. This is an effect we have all experienced, perhaps too rarely, that intellectual exultation in hearing and recognizing a distant voice that seems to be speaking just to us in that moment. And while still in the thrall of that voice, we rush to our closest friends to exclaim, have you read this novel by Albert Camus, or Hermann Hesse, or Kafka, or Gabriel Garcia Marquez? In my case, it was discovering Shakespeare at the age of 12, suddenly exposed to a range of color and shadow and light, a linguistic illumination of the human soul I had hitherto not known to exist. In one hallucinatory inhalation of language, I had become Hamlet and Ophelia, Prince Harry and Falstaff, Caesar and Petruchio. They were me and I them. And in that moment, my little life in a small town in New Jersey leapt into a universe of the mind without borders of time or place or mortality. We think we know the roadmap, the contours and borderlands of our own place in time. And to an extent, we do. It spins so furiously and so fast that before we know it, the threads of our own lives have been unspun, and what was known was lost. And what is lost is found again by others, and lost again and found again. In making films that are set in a distant world, the place we call the past, we are rediscovering what has been lost, what has been forgotten. And as we step back, our own lives continue forward into an unknown and unknowable future. So we are suspended in this tension, looking backwards as we walk the other way. Cinematic archaeologists with our trowels and magnifying glasses, our brushes and gloves, gently turning over the earth, lifting a stone, finding a shard here, a fragment there, the ancient dust of a colorful pigment, the bones of a once living man, woman, or child, if we're very lucky, a Bronze Age brooch. Little by little, we see ourselves again, as in the old chemically produced photographs. Some in this room, you remember those? The image ever so slowly appears. These Etruscans, these Peloponnesians, these Romans, these Celts, these Yankees, these Reds. They are near to us again. We recognize ourselves in them and yet find them strangely bizarre. The walls of this room fall away. We are no longer the inhabitants of our own post-Victorian dollhouse. We are now in their room, no longer in our own time, but in their time. How did they wear their hair? How did they dress? And why? What were they eating? And how did they obtain their food? How did they paint their faces or their bodies? What was the fashion in their day? How did they walk, stand, speak? What was in their minds? When they looked to the sky or over the seas, what did they envision? What did they fear? What did they desire? What were they thinking? We know what some of them are thinking, at least from the 3rd century BC. We humans are endlessly fascinated by what was and is in other people's minds. We are an interminably, incurably curious species. So it is when working on a film that is set in the past, we are overwhelmed with curiosity. I want to go there, where they lived. As a filmmaker, I want to take my audience there as well, with me. It is a paradox that in the act of bringing those distant people to our own time, in making them live again in a film, We are in fact traveling back to their time, not taking them out of their own time and place. This is the challenge of making a film set of the past. If some future filmmaker working in technologies we cannot even imagine wanted to tell a story set in our time, could this filmmaker do it with fidelity without knowing us? And how could she know us? If we could watch this film, say, 2,000 years from now, because that's how far back in time we today would have to travel to the lives of Augustus Caesar, Pontius Pilate, or Jesus of Nazareth, would we see it and say, yes, that's about right? Or would we not recognize ourselves? What an extraordinary adventure. What a thrilling journey to rediscover what has been lived and lost and found again. To find it again for one's own self and for one's own time. To see the same thing with new eyes, but to see the thing itself and not a concocted, falsified, counterfeit image. To take the past and use it to score points in the present is propaganda. To surrender to the past and to discover what it has been saying to us all along is art. Which is why it takes an open mind and an open heart to do this work. To abandon preconception and pre-intention. To become first an explorer, an archaeologist, a searcher, and a listener. Once I took the first steps down the road of making a film on Gettysburg, a journey which after 15 years took on the dimensions of a pilgrimage, if not a crusade, I came to understand that I would need to create a quiet place in which to work. How else, amid the ubiquitous cacophony of the modern world, could I possibly begin to, as Herder wrote in the 18th century, quote, perceive those distant minds, close quote. If they were speaking to me, perhaps only in a whisper, would I hear them? The first step, then, is in clearing away the noise, the distraction, the diversions of our lives. Our present tense must be shrink-wrapped down to the bare necessities. Turn the ringer off the phone. Suspend the cable TV service. These days, take a long hiatus from Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and all the other social media. Unplug, disconnect. Like Swift's Gulliver, it's amazing how lighthearted and buoyant one feels when liberated from all the online Lilliputians holding you down with their cyber ropes and cyber strings attached. Now, when your head is clear, when the incessant ringing and clanging and beeping and buzzing and chiming and gonging and gossip and gabbing has ceased, it's really quiet, you are ready to listen. Listen to those long, still voices. It was critically important as well to spend time in conversation with the living experts on the war and those who fought it. These writers, historians and professors from Gettysburg College, from Virginia Tech, and other universities, because they have the scholarship, were indispensable as guides to the best historical texts and original source material. As we know, much has been written about the war and continues to be written. To sift the wheat from the chaff would take an inordinate amount of time without the guidance these savants provided. No less a Civil War scholar than our own Bud Robertson was consulted at every step of the way in the scripting and filming of Gods and Generals. What ensues is the regular, consistent, daily work of inquiry, research, collection, reading, interviewing, meeting, traveling, seeing, walking, visiting, listening, thinking, and starting all over again. Then at some point in the process, and it varies for each and every one of us, the characters come to life in our minds. They are now alive in us. They acquire in us their unique, renewed voice. They are indeed speaking again. And at that point, and only at that point, are we ready to begin writing the script. This is what is sometimes called channeling. We, the writer, or we, the filmmaker, functions as a finely tuned instrument, providing the strings for this long-lost musician to again play or sing their ancient air. This is obviously far removed from propaganda. There may indeed be a point of view, but it is not an imposed point of view. It is, moreover, a point of view born from the subjects and the world they inhabited, from their moral universe, not ours. Novelists, playwrights, and filmmakers have been inspired by and been grappling with the Civil War for 150 years, since the dawn of cinema. Countless movies and documentaries have been made, starting early in the silent era a century ago. Many more will be made in the years and decades to come. If your intention as a filmmaker is to bring attention to your subject, if it is to illuminate, to get to the truth, it is possible to partially illuminate, to get to some of the truth, to get more light, more truth, as we all know in this room, takes generations. Each artist is inspired and makes their own personal connection, which then liberates their own muse in the application of their own craft to tell their own story. What follows are the movies we love, the ones we admire and revisit to see them over and over again. We see their flaws, we admit their shortcomings, their mistakes, but each movie in its own way is of intense interest. Each movie providing rays of light into that distant place and that intimate heart. If, on the other hand, the intention of the filmmaker is to bring attention to yourself, then illumination and truth are not of paramount interest. Where it becomes more important is the desire to shock, to outrage, to twist, to demonize, to oversimplify, perhaps to grind a fashionable axe, perhaps to burnish one's own high moral credentials with the Praetorian Guard of the politically correct, perhaps simply just to be noticed. The filmmaker in this case is saying, look at me. John Brown was not at Harper's Ferry. It was a lookalike, an imposter. The truth revealed, Stonewall Jackson was an atheist. We could go on. Each of us offering up our own ludicrous scenarios. As far-fetched as they may seem to us, some cable TV company, network, or movie studio is there to finance the myth. Everything is reduced to sorcery and sci-fi. The oft-repeated question is, what's the new angle? We all understand that Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter was not to be taken seriously. That it was intended as escapist fun. And so it was for many. Nevertheless, it shows there's always financing available to turn our ancestors into cartoons of one type or another. Buffoons, irredeemable creeps, straw men to be easily judged, or, if sanctified by the cultural gatekeepers, men of marble to set on some high, unassailable pedestal. These films don't take the first step towards the past. They're stuck fast in the quick, dry cement of the present day. Here's Johann Gottfried Herder again, writing in 1784, quote, 1784, amazing. The most damaging disease of history is an epidemic delusion of nation and epoch, to which in all ages of frail humanity is inclined. Nothing is deemed more important by us than the present. Nothing is rarer and greater than that which we experience. That comfortable or grand vanity that deems itself as the center of the world and the pinnacle of perfection, and views everything under this premise. Close quote. After making 2 epic Civil War pictures, I found I was still interested, miraculously, in the subject. It reminds me of many of you who keep writing books. Bravo. For myself, a deeper challenge remained. I had explored the intimate bonds of friendship in both Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. One need only think of the anguish expressed by both Armistead and Hancock, or the devotion of Jackson's aides. I wanted to explore a different intimacy in Copperhead. My previous pictures focused on officers and leaders, but in reality, the war was fought by teenage boys, most from small towns, whose families ended up devastated by the war, even if no battles were fought nearby. In Copperhead, the fractured relationships are between fathers and sons, the discovered friendships between young brothers and young neighbors. In the previous movies, I contrasted 2 dominant viewpoints, charging at each other with bayonets. In the South, you have the secessionists, who are willing to die for the rights of American states to break away from the Union. While to the North, the Unionists, who are just as bravely committed to defending a United States. In 1862, the year in which Copperhead is set, the abolition of slavery became an additional Union war aim. What has remained largely unsaid, at least in the popular culture, is that within each society, North and South, there were many, many factions. You had Southerners with no interest in owning slaves, nor for that matter, any interest in seceding from the Union. To the North, you had differences of opinion that were just as fractious, even violent. Not everybody who hated slavery or loved the Union was willing to send their children off to die or be maimed in a bloody battle against fellow Americans. That fascinating reality is the dramatic force driving Copperhead. The screenplay was adapted from Harold Frederick's late 19th century novel by Bill Kaufman, who is himself a heretical political thinker and prolific author whose nonfiction books have been praised for their rigor and honesty. Both Bill and I were aware of Frederick's novel. Kaufman, as a native of upstate New York region where the novel is set, had long been aware of the works of Frederick, who had witnessed firsthand the Civil War era events that he later transposed into his novel. Bill and I sparked to the intimate scale of a story set in a small town, hundreds of miles from the war, and centered on a man who is a sympathetic human, even as he stands against what we now know to be the tide of history. If anything, we felt that Abner Beach to be all the more sympathetic to a mass audience, precisely because he must fight for his beliefs without knowing how things will turn out. There are consequential choices before us at every turn in history. We have to choose without the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. You have this guy, Abner Beach, saying no when everybody around him is saying yes. His stand is thoughtful and principled, yet to his colleagues, his neighbors, eventually his family, he is viewed as a pariah, even a traitor. We observed as well that too often dissent is dramatized in films by centering on the one person in a hostile society whom history has later proved to be right. Everyone says they're in favor of dissent, but you're flattering an audience and falsifying history if you stack the deck so that all the right-thinking people of today already agree with your dissenter. If he or she is alone, say, in defending Darwin's theory of evolution, or standing up to the mob that wants to hang the witches at Salem. It's much harder, more truthful, and introduces more interesting complications if your protagonist is like Abner and opposes the very thing we now know that history has ratified, the war to uphold the United States and to end slavery. It raises the moral question, not of slavery, but of free speech. Okay, you lovers of dissent, are you going to defend this guy? We stayed close to the structure of Frederick's novel, its cast of characters and rich sense of spoken language. That line where an ear of burnt corn is described as tougher than Pharaoh's heart is so good you'd be crazy to cut it. The book is filled with them, illuminating a time and a place and a mindset that's been positively informed by the memorizing of Scripture. You live or die by who you cast. For Abner, we needed an actor who could, at a glance, make you feel the man's warmth, his groundedness, his gravity, his honesty. Billy Campbell, originally from Charlottesville, has all those qualities. I'd worked with him well on both Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, become one of my stock players, and thought of him right away for Abner. I'd also been long aware of Angus McFadden because of his terrific work in Braveheart and elsewhere. He was the ideal casting for G. He's such an inventive actor, so alive to what's happening at any moment. He takes a G into the historic but larger-than-life rage of a John Brown, wherein a person becomes capable of deadly violence for their ideals. Another key piece of casting was Peter Fonda as Abner's neighbor, Avery. This role is built up beyond the simpler character sketch provided in the novel for two reasons. There was a need to articulate Abraham Lincoln's point of view in a way that was organic to small-town life of the time, but we didn't want to fall into the trap Gore Vidal warns us about of imposing a character who is an alter ego for 21st century thought. Avery provided us with an opportunity to keep the argument local and true. Casting Peter Fonda also enriches the film in terms of his particular screen presence. You are free to think of his dad playing young Mr. Lincoln in John Ford's classic, or Peter himself as the man in search of America and Easy Rider. There is a key exchange in the film that comes when Avery, taking Lincoln's position, directly challenges Abner's anti-war stance. He asks, "Doesn't the Union mean anything to you?" What Abner says in reply grows out of a deep bond between all the characters that we tried so vividly to create in this long ago time that could just as easily have been this morning. My family means more to me, Abner tells his opponent. My farm means more. Even though we disagree, Avery, ye mean more to me than the Union. In both Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, there is an inquiry into why good, ethical, honorable men choose to go to war. My father was such a man in the Second World War. In Copperhead, we explore its mirror opposite. Why do good, ethical, honorable men choose not to go to war? And what indeed is the price of their dissent? What decades of making movies set in other times has shown me is that to get these stories to the present, it is we who must go there. We must indeed disenthrall and disenchant ourselves of the illusion of our own moral or intellectual superiority. In an act of surrender, of letting go, we create the possibility of seeing into other worlds inhabited by these strange other creatures, our ancestors. And I'd like to close with this brief poem by Walt Whitman, who speaks to us today and to future generations. He wrote this shortly after Appomattox. Pensive on her dead gazing, I heard the mother of all, desperate on the torn bodies, on the forms covering the battlefields gazing. As the last gun ceased, but the scent of the powder smoke lingered. As she called to her earth with mournful voice while she stalked, absorb them well, O my earth, she cried. I charge you, lose not my sons, lose not an atom. And you streams, absorb them well, taking their dear blood, and you local spots, and you airs that swim above lightly impalpable, and all you essences of soil and growth, and you, my river's depths, and the mountainsides and the woods where my dear children's blood trickling reddened, and you trees down in your roots to bequeath to all future trees my dead absorb, of north, of south, my young men's bodies absorb, and their precious, precious blood, which holding in trust for me, faithfully back again give me many a year hence, in unseen essence and odor of surface and grass, centuries hence. In blowing airs from the fields back again give me my darlings, give my immortal heroes, exhale me them centuries hence, breathe me their breath, let not an atom be lost. O years and graves, O air and soil, O my dead, an aroma sweet. Exhale them, perennial, sweet death, years, centuries.